All right, so we are picking up where we left off on page 24 on the third section. 3. All the raw materials, that part of the substance of the machines which has been worn out, all the labor power which performs the work, are gradually turned into a mass of commodities. Capital then throws off the appearance of industrial capital and appears as an aggregation of commodities. This, in capital, is its commodity form. But now, after production, capital has not only changed its form, it has become greater in value because it has increased during the process of production by the amount of the surplus value. And the fourth and final. The capitalist does not produce goods to satisfy his own wants, but for the market, for exchange. The commodities which are heaped up in his warehouses must be sold. The capitalist goes to the market at first as a buyer. Now he must go as a seller. At first he had money and wanted to buy commodities or means of production. Now he has commodities and wants money for them. When his commodities are sold, capital throws off its commodity form and once again assumes its money form. But the amount of money which he receives for his wares is greater than that he originally spent, because it has increased by the amount of the total surplus value. But the movement of capital is not yet finished. The increased capital is again set in motion, and receives a still greater quantity of surplus value. This surplus value is in part added to the capital and begins another circulation. The capital rolls like a snowball further and further, and with every turn, larger masses of surplus value adhere to it. And so capital's production extends further and further, and sucks ever more surplus value from the working class. This rapid growth is a feature peculiar to capitalism. Exploitation of one class by another existed in former times. Let us take, for example, a landowner in the feudal period or a slave owner of antiquity. He lived off the labor of his serfs or slaves. But everything that was produced was consumed either by himself or by his court and numerous hangers-on. Commodity production was almost non-existent. Commodities could not be sold anywhere. If the landowner or slaveholder compelled his serfs or slaves to pile up quantities of bread, fish, or meat, these simply would have rotted away. Production, therefore, was limited to the supplying of bodily wants of the master and their family. It is quite otherwise under capitalism. Now things are not produced for their use, but for profit. Wares are produced so that they may be sold, and profit thereby heaped up. The more the better. Hence the mad search of the capitalist class for profit. Their greed for this knows no bounds, and it is the pivot and driving force of capitalist production. The next section is entitled The Capitalist State. Capitalist society is, as we have seen, based upon the exploitation of the working class. A small group of men are all-powerful. The majority of the working class possess nothing. The capitalists give orders and the workers obey them. The capitalists exploit and the workers are exploited. The essence of capitalistic society consists of this incessant, ever-growing exploitation. Capitalist production is a veritable machine for the extraction of surplus value. How has this machine been preserved so long, and why do the workers tolerate this state of affairs? It is not easy to give an answer to these questions offhandedly, but broadly speaking, the cause is to be found firstly in the fact that organization and power are in the hands of the capitalists, and secondly that the bourgeoisie control the minds of the working class. The most powerful weapon in the hands of the bourgeoisie is the machinery of the state. In all capitalist countries, the state is neither more nor less than a union of capitalists. Take any country you like, England or the United States, France or Japan. Ministers, higher officials, etc., everywhere are capitalists, landlords, bankers, or their faithful and well-paid servants, being lawyers, bank directors, professors, generals, etc. The union of all of these members of the bourgeoisie which comprise the whole country and holds in it the hollow of its hand is called the state. This organization has two objectives. First, and this is the chief one, to allay unrest among and suppress risings of the workers, and so ensure the undisturbed extraction of surplus value from the working class, and further secure the system of capitalist production, and to fight similar organizations, that is, other bourgeois states, to prevent having to share their surplus value. The capitalist state is therefore a union of capitalists having for its objective the maintenance of the system under which the workers are exploited. First and foremost, the activities of this robber group are dedicated and directed to serving the interests of capital. Against this description of the capitalist state, the following objections may be given. You say that the state concerns itself solely with protecting the interests of capital, but consider in all capitalist countries there are factory laws which prohibit or restrict child labor. The working day is much shorter than formerly. In Germany, for example, in the time of William II, there was a comparatively good system of workmen's insurance. In England, the zealous minister Lloyd George introduced workmen's insurance, as well as old age pensions. And in all bourgeois states, hospitals and convalescent homes for workers have been established. Railways have been built upon which all, rich and poor, may travel. Waterways have been constructed, and in the towns, sanitation arrangements are provided. These things are for the benefit of all. Therefore, it may be said, in those countries where capital rules, the state does not look after the interests of capital exclusively, but after those of the workers as well, and the state even punishes at times capitalists when they infringe on these factory laws. However, such answers are not convincing for the following reasons. It is true that the bourgeois governing power sometimes will pass laws or regulations which are useful to the working class. Nevertheless, these measures really serve the interests of the bourgeoisie themselves. Take, for example, railways. They are used by the workers, but they also make use of the workers. They are not built at or for the desire of the workers. They are used by merchants and manufacturers to carry their merchandise, for the transport of troops, and for taking workers to the scene of their labor, etc. Capital uses railways. It builds them and thereby pursues its own aims. They are useful to the workers, but they are nevertheless built by the capitalist state. Or let us take the cleaning of the towns, the so-called municipal welfare work in hospitals. The bourgeoisie pay attention to the working class quarters, but the parts of the town in which the workers live are not so clean as bourgeois districts. Disease finds in them a favorable breeding ground. Still, the bourgeoisie do something. Why is this? Simply because if they did not, disease would become epidemic and would spread over the whole town, and the bourgeoisie themselves would suffer. It is evident, therefore, that here also the bourgeois state and its machinery serve the interests of the bourgeoisie in the first place. Still another example. In France, the workers learned during the last century from the bourgeoisie how to artificially limit families. They had either no children at all, or not more than 2. The workers are so poor that it is very difficult or almost impossible to support a large family. The result is that the population of France is almost stationary. But the French bourgeoisie wanted soldiers, and they raised the alarm that the nation was going to ruin, that the Germans were increasing more quickly than we were, and they will have more soldiers. It is noteworthy that the standard of health of recruits to the army was getting lower every year, with the new soldiers being undersized and weak-chested. All of a sudden, the bourgeoisie suddenly became generous. They began of themselves to press for improvements of the conditions for the workers, so that these would become physically fitter and would be able to bring more children into the world. The bourgeoisie had no desire to kill the goose which laid its golden egg. In all of these examples, the bourgeoisie themselves enact measures beneficial to the workers, and thereby follow their own interests. There are also instances where these beneficial measures were passed by the bourgeoisie under pressure from the working class, and such laws are numerous. Almost all of the factory laws were passed in this way, through threats on the part of the workers. In England, the first shortening of the working day to 10 hours was achieved by pressure from the workers. In Russia, the Tsarist government passed the first factory laws through fear of strikes and industrial unrest. The state, the enemy of the working class, reasoned as follows. It is better to give something today than to be compelled to give twice as much tomorrow, or to place our lives in jeopardy. Just as the manufacturers give way to strikes and agree to give them part of what they demand without ceasing to be manufacturers, so too the bourgeois state does not cease to be what it is when, under the menace of industrial unrest, it flings something to the workers. The capitalist state is not only the greatest and most powerful organization of the bourgeoisie, but also the most intricate, having numerous divisions from which tentacles stretch outwards in all directions. And all this has for its main object is the preservation of the right to exploit the working class and extend their area of exploitation. Against the working class, brute force is used, as is machinery for their mental enslavement. These constitute the most important organs of the state. The machinery of brute force consists of the army, police, gendarmerie, prisons, courts of justice and their auxiliaries, spies, agents provocateur, organizations of strikebreakers, hired murderers, etc. The army of the capitalist state is organized on a special plan. At its head stand the officers, the ones wearing gold braid. They are drawn from the ranks of the sons of the nobility and the grand bourgeoisie, and in part from intellectuals. They are the bitterest enemies of the proletariat, and in their boyhood they are taught in special schools how to browbeat soldiers and to guard the honor of the officer's uniform, that is, to keep the soldiers in a state of complete slavery and turn them into automatons. The foremost of the nobles are generals and admirals. The officers have the whole mass of common soldiers completely under their power, and the soldiers are so trained that they do not dare to ask why they have to fight. They have to obey implicitly the orders of their officers. Such an army is, in the first place, designed for the purpose of subduing the workers. In Russia, the army was used repeatedly as a means of suppressing workers and peasants. Under Alexander II, there were, before the abolition of serfdom, many peasant risings, and they were all crushed by the army. In the year 1905, workers were shot down by the army during the rebellion in Moscow. The army carried through the punitive expeditions in the Baltics, in the Caucasus, and in Siberia. In the years 1906 to 1908, it suppressed the rising of peasants against landlords, saving the landlord's property. During this war, workers in Ivanovo, Kostroma, etc. were shot. The officers everywhere were particularly obnoxious. In other countries, the same thing occurred. In Germany, the army of the capitalist state acted the part of the murderer of workers. The first mutiny of sailors was smothered by the army, and the movements of the workers in Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, and all over the country were suppressed by the army. In France, workmen on strike were frequently shot. Even now, in that country, workers and Russian revolutionary soldiers are shot. In England, the English army in recent times has smothered in blood rebellions of Irish workers, of Egyptian slaves, of Indians, and in England itself it has dispersed gatherings of working men. In Switzerland, during every strike, the machine gun commandos and the so-called militia, i.e. the Swiss army, are mobilized. In the United States of America, the army has several times completely burned down workers' settlements, as during the strike in Colorado. The armies of the capitalist states are now throttling the workers' revolutions in Russia, Hungary, the Balkans, and in Germany, and suppressing them the whole world over. We will stop here for now and pick up again on page 30 under the section Police and the Gendarmerie.